Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so happy that so many of you came out. My name is Steve Elkins. I'm the chapter chair for the Explorers Club here in Southern California. And I first want to send my appreciation to Peter and Annie for allowing us to use the auditorium here. Peter's a member of the club. I don't think Annie is, but she's very cordial in letting us do this. I believe this is going to be quite an interesting lecture. Just a little bit of background very quick before I turn it over to Philip. I'm currently working on a project about pre-Columbian maritime explorations of the Americas. I'm working with a colleague of mine who's here, Bing Li from China, and we're trying to figure out how many people came to America by boat before Columbus. Because I think, as most of you, when we went to school, we were taught Columbus discovered America in 1492. We know, yeah, he came in 1492, but he was the last of a long line of people coming to the Americas. And it turns out now, and actually most younger archaeologists and anthropologists will agree, that people have been coming to the Americas for a very long time by boat, by land, and mainly by boat. The question is, how long, where did they come from? Well, thanks to people like Philip Beale, who will be giving the speech soon, we're finding out just how widespread this maritime exploration's been going on for thousands of years. So it sort of goes in the face of much of what we were taught. But that's what science and discovery and exploration is all about. You know, turning everything upside down, we're always finding something new, and something is only a fact until we find out it isn't a fact and another fact takes its place. So Philip Beale is from England, and he's got quite an interesting background. He's a member of the Royal Geographic Society and the Society for Scientific Exploration. I think I got it close. All right, so he's got a lot of accolades for what he's done. He was also an officer in the Royal Navy, a very successful businessman. He has a history in his family of seafaring. I think one of his ancestors was a famous sea captain in England in the day. So he has it built in his blood. And he also has a great appreciation and interest in history. And he likes to know, like, what happened in ancient sea voyaging. He wants to know, how did people disperse around the world? So here is this very soft-spoken English gentleman who actually has the fortitude, the guts, the persistence, and willing to put everything on the line to build ancient craft, thousands of years old, the same way they were built thousands of years ago, with the same materials, the same construction techniques. A lot of people thought, you're crazy, Philip, you're wasting your life, you're wasting your money, you're going to fail. But as I guess you can assume, he did not fail and he succeeded. And he's proven that these transoceanic voyages were possible thousands of years ago without all that much difficulty. Now, I also want to shout out, and sitting next to Philip in front is Danielle Eubank. You could stand up a second, who is in the Explorers Club also, and she has been a good friend of Philip's for many years and has been the expedition artist on 2 of his voyages. His first voyage was with an ancient Indonesian boat, 1,500 years old, called the Borobudur. I always had a hard time explaining that. Sailed from Indonesia, crossed the Indian Ocean, and then around Africa up to Ghana, which was a pretty amazing feat in an ancient sea craft. And then he said, well, that's not enough. I'm going to build a boat from 2,500 years ago that the Phoenicians used, because I believe they crossed the Atlantic and came to the Americas, which is what he's mainly going to talk about. It's a pretty amazing story. With that, I'm going to shut up, and I'm going to turn it up to Philip Beale, who I think you're very fortunate to meet a person of his character doing what he did. There are very few people who can do this. I will say, believe he was inspired by Thor Heyerdahl in a way. I think many of you might know who Thor Heyerdahl was, who first came up with these ideas. So, Philip, take it over.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for that amazing introduction, Steve. In fact, that introduction was so good, I really can't wait to hear myself speak. Because that's, quite extraordinary, and I'm not sure that all of the things I have done quite justify that. But thank you to the Bowers Museum, to the Explorers Club, and for all of you for coming, I know, some quite considerable distances to be here. So thank you very much. What I'm going to do is to break my lecture really into three parts. I'm going to talk first of all about the construction of the ship, how it was built in modern-day Syria, in an ancient Phoenician city. I'm then going to talk a little bit about what the ancients knew of the lands to the west, what they knew about the Atlantic, and putting together a little bit of the puzzle that persuaded, if you like, Columbus to take the journey to the Americas. And then, of course, I'm going to talk a little bit about the voyage itself, the thrills and spills and the challenges. So that's my little agenda. But before I get into the nitty-gritty, I just want to remind you, I think you all know who the Phoenicians were, but let me just give you a quick sort of recap. The Phoenicians were the civilization that lasted about 1,000 years from 1200 BC to 146 BC, and they inhabited this area of the eastern Mediterranean from Tyre in modern-day Lebanon to Sidon up to Beirut and to Arwad in modern-day Syria. And history records that the queen of, well, she was to be the queen of Tyre, the daughter of the king of Tyre. She fell out with her father, and she left in about the 9th century with a group of sea captains. They first visited Cyprus, and then legend has it that Queen Dido, or Elisa, she's also called, came to Carthage in modern-day Tunisia, and Carthage became incredibly successful and powerful. And so powerful, you may recall, there's that famous quote from the Senate in Rome that Carthage must be destroyed. And after 100 years of 3 Punic wars, eventually Carthage was destroyed in about 146 BC. So that was really the end of the Phoenician era. And as I think we all know, the victors write the history. So we don't know a huge amount about the Phoenicians because the Romans pretty much wrote them out of history. But we do know quite a bit, but not as much as the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans that are all taught in schools. But the Phoenicians have been forgotten. And I hope that what I'm doing in a very small way is helping to try and redress that balance, because they were an incredible civilization. If you had a glass of wine at lunchtime, it was the Phoenicians who first cultivated white wine and introduced it to Europe. They introduced olive oil to Europe. They traded industrial quantities of tin, lead, gold, silver from the Iberian Peninsula here and from England all the way back across the Mediterranean, 2,000 to 3,000 miles, because the Middle East was always short of for metals. They developed glass blowing, and the other thing for which they are famous for is they developed the purple dye. And purple in the ancient world was worth, more than its weight in gold. And even today, purple is associated with royalty, of course, and with religion. And what the Phoenicians did was to discover how to make this purple dye from the murex shell. And I'm going to just hand round a little display case of these different types of shell, and it was the gland of the murex shell that they cut open and created the dye, and then within 24 hours, if they put it on some material, it would create the purple, which the Greeks called the Phoenicians, the purple people or the purple empire, because they were associated with this commodity. And I'll just get that little presentation. So you can just have a look as that's passed around, the different shells and the different colors. And I'll talk a tiny bit about it a little later. The other thing is that the Phoenicians, they inhabited that land strip in the Eastern Mediterranean. Basically, they turned to the sea because they had exhausted the agricultural opportunities in the Levant, basically. And they became expert sailors. And the Greeks called them, the most successful seamen and traders. They discovered, for example, the pole star. They were the first to sail out of the sight of land. And as I mentioned, they sailed thousands of miles. They were not just little coastal traders. They were ocean-going explorers. And they were the first true global traders. They traded on 3 continents, with Asia, with Africa, and Europe. And potentially, I don't think the evidence is absolutely there yet, but my mission is ultimately to get more interest and to show that ultimately they probably reached the Americas. And I'll explain my thinking in a little bit. So that's just a very quick recap on who the Phoenicians were. So you may be asking, well, what was my motivation for this voyage, the Phoenicians before Columbus, to sail across the Atlantic? My motivation was this rock drawing. This rock drawing is at some caves called Laja Alta in Spain, and these caves overlook the Straits of Gibraltar and the Bay of Gibraltar. And I think you can see here a huge, great sail and some oars, a figurehead here, and some people on the stern. The date of this rock drawing is between the 7th and 9th century BC, when archaeologists tell us that the Phoenicians were arriving around Gibraltar and starting to develop Cadiz on the Spanish peninsula. So I reasoned that if they had these large ships by the Straits of Gibraltar looking out onto the Atlantic, then surely there must have been a great chance that over the next several hundred years, some of them would have made it across the Atlantic. So that was this, once I had been made aware of this rock drawing, this was my inspiration. And I set out simply with the ambition of starting the expedition in modern-day Carthage in Tunisia, sailing the boat out of the Mediterranean, calling in at Gibraltar and Cadiz, and going down to Essaouira in Morocco, which was one of the most important Phoenician ports on the Atlantic coast, and then dropping into the Canaries, as indeed Columbus did. And the Canaries, again, were known to the Phoenicians, and archaeologists now have confirmed that there was contact with the Canary Islands, and I'm sure many of you have been to the Canary Islands. And then my plan was just to let the ship pretty much find its way across the Atlantic without any predetermined destination in mind, other than to get to the other side. So, a little bit then about the building of the vessel. The vessel, after 2 or 3 years of research, the building commenced in 2017, and it was based on a Phoenician stroke Eastern Mediterranean originated vessel, a wreck that was found near Marseille called the Jules Verne 7. And we got access to the information that was contained in the structure of that boat, you know, the ribs, the pegs, where the mast was. And we were then able to design the Phoenicia in line with the knowledge of that wreck that was dated to 600 BC, which is the date that Herodotus said the Phoenicians first circumnavigated Africa under the auspices of Pharaoh Necho. So it took a little time to do that, but we were then able to build the ship. And we chose this island in Syria called Arwad, which was one of the great Phoenician city-states. The Phoenicians were never really a country as such. They were just a group of city-states, but they shared some common cultural characteristics. And in doing an exercise like this, obviously we wanted to record it and document it. And as you've already heard, my friend and colleague Daniel Eubank here was part of that project. She is here painting the initial building and construction of the ship. And in addition to having Danielle as the exhibition artist, we also had camera crews filming the project for a documentary, and we were also posting photos and stuff on the internet for the followers of the project. This is just the start of the project, where the keel has been laid, and you can see the pegs that are being driven into the keel to link the planks to. And in the next picture, you can see here the planks that are edge on edge. So they're not overlapped, they're edge on edge planks, and then dowels are driven in to the pegs which link them. And you've got here the first real example in shipping of a mortise and tenon joint. And of course, when the planks go in the water, the planks plim up and make a very strong structure. And the Romans called this the Phoenician joints. And the important thing to understand here is that up until this time, can you believe this, but boats were actually sewn together. And of course, the cord that they used to sew the boats and the planks together would rot. The boats or the hull would be very flexible. But once the Phoenicians developed this system of mortise and tenon joints and the planks, they created the first robust hull. And that gave them a huge competitive advantage. And not only that, they then were the first peoples to use iron nails, which they drove through the planks into the ribs to strengthen further the hull. So they were the first people in the Mediterranean and worldwide to create a robust hull that could undertake these long journeys. And I've got a little model of the woodwork involved, and please be careful with it, but I'm going to show you one of the 10-inch iron nails that we had manufactured to recreate this whole process. So the little model here, you'll see there's two planks. You'll see the pegs that link the planks together, and you'll see the olive dowels that do the work. And what this really sort of meant was also that in terms of the water integrity of the boat, because the planks were joined together edge on edge, as we say, they didn't need to be caulked. Unlike the Arab boats that needed a lot of cotton and resin to caulk them, these boats needed very little caulking. They did make a paste of chalk and olive oil to seal the gaps between the planks, but nothing as much as the Arab dhows would have had. And just to continue this little bit on the construction, the thing that the boat builders in the island of Arwad didn't realize until I talked to them was they thought they built Phoenician boats. But we had to explain to them that actually they built boats in quite a modern way, with the skeleton first and then tacking the planks on afterwards. But the ancients built the keel and the planks first, and then they strengthened them. It was almost like an evolutionary thing from like a log canoe. As the cargoes got larger and larger, they added more and more planks and then more and more ribs to strengthen the hull. And this is what you can see here. The whole of the hull is virtually created before they start putting in the ribs. So we had to teach them how to do this, but as soon as they got the hang of it, they were, pretty quick and very clever in how they did it. And they did it, most of this, by sight and feel. Although, obviously we had plans, but they interpreted those plans as expert carpenters and shipwrights. And here you can see the first ribs being put into the ship. And that process continued until it was structurally ready, and with the iron nails that I've shown you being driven into the ribs from the outside. They didn't use a huge amount of iron nails, but enough to give a little bit of extra strength to the hull. And coming up to about May 2008, we had this beautiful ship, or the hull, ready to go into the water in Arwad. And this is the first, literally, few hours of the boat, with lots of young people on celebrating the sort of pre-launch, really, of the boat. We put it in there just to sort of plim it up and sort of make sure it didn't sink immediately. And if you're wondering sort of how it actually sails, what it looks like, I'm just going to show you this little clip now of her under sail. So that little clip was taken as the Phoenicia entered the Mediterranean by the Straits of Gibraltar. And you can see, for those of you who are sailors, sailing her is quite a challenge. It's almost like sailing with a spinnaker most of the time. And for those who sail, sailing with a spinnaker can cause all sorts of problems if the wind happens to go from the wrong side. So it was quite a challenge, but with a well-trained crew, it's quite an enjoyable experience, but challenging nonetheless to sail her. And she's pretty much a downwind sailor, but exciting nonetheless. So that was really the building of the ship in a nutshell. I just wanted to come now to really a little bit about what the ancients knew and the clues that we have that the ancients knew perhaps more than we think they knew about the Atlantic and, as it's described in some of the literature, the lands to the west. So we give the little history lesson here, but I think most of us will know about Pythagoras. I put Pythagoras in here because he was a Phoenician. He was obviously an expert in trigonometry and geography and many other things as well. Aristotle, I put Aristotle in because he was the first, although most people know him as a writer and a philosopher, but he was the first to understand and scientifically demonstrate that the world was round. He observed that certain constellations could only be seen from different parts of Earth, and therefore, clearly, the world was not flat. And he also observed that ships going over the horizon didn't just suddenly disappear. They gradually got out of view because of the curvature of the Earth. So he was able to demonstrate that the world was round. And this story that you often hear, that the ancients thought they would fall off the edge of the world, is simply not true. It was if you like, a belief that happened in the Middle Ages, that sailors did in that period believe that they might fall off the edge of the world. But the ancients knew better, and they knew the world was a sphere. And you had some incredible thinkers. So Eratosthenes, for example, he was the chief librarian at the Alexandria Library. He had 150 librarians working for him. And in his greatest achievement was to calculate within 3% the accurate circumference of the world, which he made about 25,000 miles. And he did it with an ingenious experiment based partly on a well near Aswan and Alexandria. And he was able to calculate the distance, and using this well where he, in the summer solstice, he managed to get a complete perpendicular line, and then at Alexandria he was able to put a stick in the ground to measure the angle, and then he worked out that was a 7.5 degrees angle, and multiplied it up by 360 degrees, and he was able to calculate the circumference of the Earth. Now, bear with me. Hipparchus, he was one of the sort of great details person of his time, and he plotted some 8,000 towns and cities from the capital of China right the way through to the Atlantic. And he worked out the length of the known world. And as I say, he was known for his accuracy and his detail. He spent his whole life working on these issues of the latitude and longitude, or at least plotting the positions of both stars, but also these towns and cities. And then a sort of very strange thing happened, and that is that Marinus of Tyre, who, coming from Tyre, he had a Phoenician mother or a Greek father. He recalculated the size of the world, and he made it 18,000 miles. And Ptolemy came along with his Geographia and basically went along with Marinus of Tyre's false circumference of the world. And the reason that Ptolemy is important here is that in the 15th century, 15 years before Columbus sailed, Ptolemy's treatise on geography was published, and it showed effectively not only the size of the known world, but, if you like, the distance from, shall we say, the Atlantic islands to Cathay, which was Japan, China, India. And he made this big mistake, which was endorsed by Ptolemy. And Columbus took this as the truth. In fact, Columbus made it worse. What Columbus did was he said that mariners of Tyre didn't know about some islands that were to the east of China, and therefore the world was even smaller. So Columbus, it appears, believed that he could sail from Spain, and within a few weeks he could reach Cathay, the Far East, with just a couple of, not realizing that there was this huge continent that we're sat in right now, and there was the Pacific Ocean as well. So mariners of Tyre and Columbus conspired, if you like, to bring about the discovery of the Americas. But Hipparchus calculated that the known world didn't end at the Canary Islands. He was talking about some islands that were much further to the west, some 3,500 miles to the west. And the reason that this has been sort of concluded is that clearly you couldn't move the capital of China. Therefore, when you're looking at the length of the known world, we come up with a figure about 3,500 miles further to the west than the Canary Islands. Now, the Canary Islands were known as the Fortunate Islands, and then there is some confusion in the ancient texts about the Blessed Islands or the Hesperides Islands. But there are several accounts that say that sailors were sailing for 40 days beyond Spain and returning from islands. So we have various accounts of these journeys that are made, and the only logical explanation is that Hipparchus was talking about different islands than what Ptolemy was talking about. Ptolemy was effectively fudging the issue, and when he drew his map, if you look at the Ptolemy map of geography, the Geographia, the United Kingdom, for example, is pretty much shown from west to east, not north to south, because he's trying to fit it all in to overcome this problem. So that gives you a little hint that the ancients did know about these islands, and I've sort of documented what we know in my book, which I'll mention a little later. But so is it plausible that the Phoenicians could have, done these voyages that I've just mentioned? Well, I want to mention Strabo here. He is the father of geography, and he was writing in the 1st century. He records the Phoenicians had 300 trading settlements down the eastern Atlantic coast, from Portugal, Spain, all the way down to Morocco, possibly as far as Senegal. Now, even if you believe the 300 trading settlements are an exaggeration, even if there were 50 trading settlements, that's a lot of boats and ships that are trading with them and bringing fish and African goods, skins, various metals into the Mediterranean. So the point is that the Phoenicians were very active on this coast. And I'll just give you a few more examples of the activities of the Phoenicians and why it's likely that the voyages that we made were quite practical in the ancient period. First of all, you may have seen this. This is a chart originally drawn by Benjamin Franklin, the founding father of America, or one of the founding fathers. And he observed that on the ships, the mail ships coming to England, that they reached London more quickly than on the return journey. And then he basically created the theory of the Gulf Stream and the currents taking ships across this way and around, and this would have made it a lot easier for the Phoenicians to have come from the Mediterranean across to the Americas. I'll just give you a couple more examples. Just over 200 odd years ago, in the Azores, and the Azores are about 900 miles to the west of Portugal, a set of Carthaginian coins were found, and these coins were dated to the 4th century BC. There was a commission in the 1960s by the Swedish government because the owner and the sort of report writer of these coins was Swedish, and they concluded that the find was genuine and that these coins were indeed found in the Azores. So we have, if you like, a little bit of evidence that the Carthaginians were active in the Azores. We also have fairly new evidence that in the southwest of England, the Phoenicians or Carthaginians, I use this sort of term interchangeably, were trading with the southwest of England. So just a few years ago, the British Museum confirmed that a Carthaginian coin that was found in Bristol, in the southwest of England after a flood, was indeed authentic and represented the fact that there were Phoenicians trading with the southwest of England. And since then, an Israeli group of archaeologists who've excavated a wreck in Israel, or in Israeli waters, indeed had tin ingots that they've traced to Devon and Cornwall in England. And that's a distance of 2,000 to 3,000 miles. So you can see the vast journeys that the Phoenicians were making, and indeed how active they were in the Atlantic, because we've got this evidence that the Phoenicians were active on the eastern Atlantic seaboard. At this stage, you might be wondering, well, why don't we know more about, these the activities of the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians? I'd like to make 2 points here. The first is the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians were the first recorded sailors in the Atlantic. There were 2 admirals, Carthaginian admirals. One was Himilco, who undertook a voyage to northern Europe. We don't know a lot about exactly where he went, but it's recorded that he made a voyage, quite a big expedition. And there was another admiral called Haino, and he undertook an expedition around West Africa, and it seems like from the descriptions that the Carthaginians recorded, he reached as far south as the Cameroons. So we know that they were the first, but we don't know a lot more than that, other than what archaeologists are discovering in these various places now. But the reason why we don't know a lot more is, imagine tomorrow morning we all wake up and our smartphones don't work and all of our hard disks on our computers are completely destroyed. We would suddenly be left with a dark ages which would go back, perhaps, shall we say, to the 1960s or the 1970s, because we wouldn't have, we wouldn't know how to operate, and nothing would probably operate. Well, basically, that's my argument, what happened in the ancient world. First of all, the great library in Carthage, which housed pretty much a third, maybe 40% of the world's knowledge that was destroyed by the Romans. So, in one stroke, a huge amount of knowledge that would have helped us in this discussion was not available. And then this happened. The great library in Alexandria was destroyed by fire, and some 100,000 scrolls, the equivalent of 40,000 books, and I mentioned earlier the 150 librarians that were there, that was destroyed by fire. So overnight, the knowledge of the ancient world was completely or largely destroyed. Where there was knowledge was in the Arab world, but there was the need obviously for translations and the like, and there are some clues as to what the Arabs were or knew about the world, but basically the knowledge in Europe completely disappeared. So that's why we don't know as much about this, but there are, as I say, texts and clues that the ancients did know, and there was records of voyages to the Americas, some 40 days sailing from Spain. So that sort of concludes the basis of my belief that the Phoenicians were likely to have reached the Americas. So we then set about building this expedition and undertaking it. We brought the boat back to the United Kingdom due to the disruptions and civil war in Syria, and so we sailed the boat from England to Carthage in Tunisia, and on the way, the boat had got into a bit of disrepair over the years. We're talking now 2019, and so on the outward voyage to Carthage, we were getting the crew to rebuild parts of the boat. We were getting we made our own new sail out of cotton because the last one had rotted. So there was a lot of work and preparation to happen before we could set sail from Carthage. And when we got to Carthage in Tunisia, the Tunisian authorities were absolutely delighted, were incredibly hospitable because they were grateful that we had recognized the importance of Carthage for starting our expedition. And the local schools and some voluntary organizations deluged us with stalls and food, and in the final preparation for our voyage to the Americas. And this picture just shows some of the supplies coming on board. And by the 28th of September, we were ready to leave Tunisia, and we sailed out into the Gulf of Tunis. Now, it was a pretty choppy afternoon and evening as we left, and we had quite a few people who were inexperienced at being at sea. I mean, we had a number of us were experienced, but there were quite a few on board that weren't. And at about 1 o'clock in the morning, I get a call from this wonderful gentleman called Mohammed Ghassan. He's the world's expert, as it happens, and he's one of our hosts, but he's the world expert on purple dye. And he put that little presentation together about the dye that you've just seen. He called me and said, Captain, you're in danger. What's wrong with the ship? Is it sinking? And luckily, we were still in mobile phone distance. And I said, Mohammed, it's pretty rough out here, but there's no problem. He said, well, I've just had a phone call from one of the wives of your crew. As it happened, one of the American crew members. And he said she had a text message from one of these GPS alert systems that the ship was in danger and needed assistance. I said, well, everything's fine. There's not a problem. Let me go and find out. But don't worry, we're okay. So I went down, found this gentleman called Doug, And I said, Doug, have you sent a message to your wife that we're in danger? He said, no, Philip, I sent her a message that everything's fine. I said, well, the message that she got was that we're in danger, and if we weren't in mobile phone contact, you would have started an international search and rescue operation before we'd even started the expedition. So, we've got satellite communications and email. Please, could you switch your device off? And because we can't be dealing with that. So he was terribly apologetic that he had switched the wrong button and sent the wrong message, unfortunately. So that's how we started. But we made our way down the Mediterranean, and we were well received in Gibraltar and Cadiz. And Cadiz was, and still is a destination that has an incredible collection of Phoenician culture and artifacts, if you ever get the chance to go to the museum there. But we then sailed down from Cadiz to Mogador on the coast of Morocco, which, as I think I mentioned, was one of the great one of the great trading ports for the Phoenicians. And the problem was that we had a strong northerly wind, and you can see here this wind was so strong that we've reefed the sail right up. And one of the things about one of the inventions, just one of them that the Phoenicians achieved, was they created the first reefing system. So we were able to reef the sail without lowering the boom. So this is what we're doing here. We're sort of spilling the wind because the wind is so strong. We've reduced the sail exposure, but it was really strong. And the gap into the sort of the inner bay of Mogador is very narrow with some pretty frightening rocks. And so I had to put one of the crew members on a sort of chart plotter because we couldn't make out any leading lights as we came into that channel. And all day long we'd been dodging these little fishing boats, so we were exhausted, and we came in about midnight in the dark. But I told one of my crew members that he had to watch the electronic chart plotter, and if it deviated, he was to come back to me and the guys on the helm, and we would try and avoid the danger of the rocks because we didn't want to muck it up. But it was quite a worrying entry. And we didn't have a depth sounder, so eventually when we got in a certain distance, we dropped the anchor, and then the next morning the harbour master invited us to come into the inner harbour, and we roped up alongside this search and rescue vessel. And on the far side, here you can see lots of these little fishing boats that are out there at night and caused us quite a lot of problems, because even if we're doing 5 or 6 knots, the kind of sail we've got, it's very difficult to dodge these little fishing boats. But these fishing boats don't take much notice of a wooden boat like Phoenicia. So it was definitely challenging getting in. But again, the Moroccan authorities there were incredibly pleased that we'd recognized that the Phoenicians' role in Essaouira and Morocco was significant. So we received a lot of hospitality, and we then left from Morocco, and with a relatively short stay in the Canary Islands, we then set off on the most important part of our journey, which was crossing the 3,500 miles of the Atlantic. And we had some interesting times on board, as you can imagine. One of the first things that happened, we got pushed much further south than I thought we would. We got down to about probably 500 miles sort of north west of the Cape Verde Islands, and this hawk, or so I actually call it a falcon, dropped in to see us, and you can see it's absolutely beautiful bird, and we gave it water. It was hundreds of miles from where it should have been. The crew named it, but it unfortunately doesn't have any webbed feet. And one morning I was on the deck and I saw it fly off. It dived into the water, presumably after a fish, and I'm afraid it was literally out of his depth, no webbed feet, and we never saw it again. So it was rather sad, and it just got too far offshore, basically, because we were, by then, hundreds of miles from the African coast and from the Canary Islands. And then we had another sort of wildlife issue. You remember the stalls that I mentioned. We took as much fresh food as we could, and one of the crew members noticed that our bags of apples were suddenly getting little holes in the sides of the apples. And to be honest, I sort of dismissed it, really. I thought, it's probably a nice little mouse, poor little thing. He's just eating a few apples. But then we discovered that our rice and that some of our pasta bags were being opened, and there was something much more nasty and aggressive than a little mouse. And but we weren't quite sure what it was. We had our suspicions. And then one night, one of the crew members called Max, who was a bit of a joker, to be fair, was always a happy, laughing sort of guy. He said, I saw a rat run across the deck. And he said, I chased it, but I don't know where it went. And we weren't sure whether to believe him. And then the next night, he said, I saw the rat again. And it ran across and went down a hole. And finally, I was doing a round early one morning down below, checking for leaks and that the boat wasn't about to sink anyway. And I saw this rat jumping along the containers that contained all our food and water. So I knew we had a rat. We thought, well, how are we going to get rid of this rat? Because obviously there's a terrible health risk. And not also, of course, if it gets into our water containers, then we would have a problem. So the first idea we had was to get the generator and the engine, close all the hatches and try and make it as airtight as possible and try and kill it off with carbon monoxide. And we did that for about 4 or 5 hours until we could bear the smell and stuff no longer. Anyway, sure enough, a couple of days later, the rat was out and about again. It might have given it a bad headache, but it was still alive. So then my friend and co-conspirator, Yuri, I don't know if you can read this, but it says, it has a great sense of humor, Minnie Mouse Nightclub. So Yuri's Brazilian, he's the film cameraman and director, and he's used to making traps in Brazil for various projects. So he made this trap. The first time the rat went in, but it got out, took the food and got out. The second time I went down early in the morning, and this whole trap was vibrating. There was a very angry rat in it. Anyway, Yuri then went and got the trap, brought it up on deck, and we put a rope around the trap and then threw it overboard, left it there for sort of 5 minutes, and we brought it back, and anyway, the rat was gone. And there was just huge relief and jubilation that we got rid of this rat, because everybody was quite worried. Some people said they'd, thought the rat had got in their hair at night. And of course, many of them were sleeping below on the deck. As soon as the rat had emerged, they wanted to sleep in hammocks. So it caused quite a lot of worry and upset. And but one of the crew members thought that actually what we'd done by drowning it was quite barbaric, and wasn't very happy with it. But most of the crew were delighted, as indeed I was. Talking of the crew, this is the crew that made that journey across the Atlantic. If I point them out, as we say, we've met Yuri. We had Shema, who's a Lebanese girl. We had this lady Moran, who was a Dutch doctor and our health and safety lady. We had 2 Norwegians, this guy Steiner and Deirdre up here. These guys I met a few years ago, and they sail Viking replica ships for a living, and they made a fantastic contribution to the expedition. We had 2 of my former guys from Indonesia, shipwrights, very talented guys, and a few Brits as well, and another Lebanese guy here as well. So it was a multinational crew, multi-faith, mixed crew. We did have a few quite interesting discussions, sort of evolution versus creation and things like that. But we actually all got on pretty well. Everybody does the cooking and the washing, and that, so responsibilities are pretty evenly divided. So we finally, after 5 weeks, I think 39 days at sea, we sighted land at Guadeloupe. We went through the sort of Guadeloupe Canal, and we thought that as the wind was blowing us in that direction, we were much further south than I thought. We ended up in Santa Dominica, in the Dominican Republic, and the Dominican Republic Navy, at very short notice, as I say, we didn't have a fixed destination, said we would host the landfall of Phoenicia, and they welcomed us with as you see here, a brass band and quite a big celebration, and they looked after us for 3 weeks. And there is certainly a belief in the Dominican Republic that the Phoenicians arrived there 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. Not sure whether there's any absolute proof of that, but there's certainly a belief there that the Phoenicians did arrive there. And it was interesting because clearly this is where Columbus made his administrative headquarters for his enterprise of the Indies. And he had also taken 39 days to get, in his case, to get to the Bahamas, but had then eventually come further south, as you know, and made the Dominican Republic. It was then Hispaniola, the whole island of the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, of course. So he, there was a parallel there, and just to create a bit of balance, I suppose, on the one hand, Columbus's voyage may not have happened had the mistake that I talked about in his misunderstanding of the size of the earth. He may never have done the voyage had that mistake not have happened and Marinus of Tyre not miscalculated the world, the size of the world. But clearly what Columbus did was to kickstart the age of discovery, and on his founding of the New World, European maritime capitals suddenly started sending ships out to the west to explore new lands and to find gold, and there were clearly a lot of economic opportunities for that. On the negative side, his soldiers clearly exterminated, if you like, but were absolutely barbaric, killed virtually all of the Arawak and Taino Indians, and then their successors in Central America, the soldiers and conquistadors, literally murdered millions. And what's often not known about Columbus is that he was the grandfather, if you like, of the Caribbean to European slave trade. So he, in the second voyage, sailed back to Spain with 500 slaves, of which 200 died on the way back. And on the third voyage, he was incarcerated and imprisoned, and only eventually pardoned by the King and Queen of Spain, who allowed him to do his fourth voyage. So his history is, frankly checkered at best. And I won't say sort of more, but he is not the great sailor who sailed the ocean blue that you've often read, or I read as a schoolboy. The story is much worse than that. So just to put that in there for the record, as it were. We then sailed up from the south of the Dominican Republic through the channel between Haiti and Cuba, and pretty much having reached the Dominican Republic, our expedition and proof that a Phoenician ship could do huge distances and reach landfall had been done. So we hit some very strong headwinds in that channel. We motored into them as much as we could. I was one night down below. I'd taken a watch, and then I retired to my bunk. And the next morning at 5:30 in the morning, I came back on watch. I knew that the guys would have had a tough night. And so I said, how did it go, guys? And they said, well, it's been a really terrible night. I said, really? I said, I slept through everything. And they said, well, the horse's head that's on the prow here, the guy said that went underwater at one point, and tons of water came over the deck. And I said, well, I never heard any of it. So, but yeah, they had a frightening time. But then luckily the winds dropped and we were able to push on, and we eventually reached the outskirts of Fort Lauderdale. And the reason that we aimed for Fort Lauderdale was that the Coral Ridge Yacht Club had kindly agreed to host a sort of an official welcome for us. And we were absolutely staggered by, what we saw coming into Fort Lauderdale. We saw these incredible, sports boats and literally scores of super yachts with helicopters and the like on the back, and these amazing mansions. And of course, we had been sort of living a very basic life, eating tinned food with pasta and rice and fish. And literally for the last 5 months, other than what we'd managed to, obtain in the Dominican Republic. So it was a bit of a culture shock, to be frank, but at least we'd achieved it. And this is the team who made it, if you like, into Fort Lauderdale. And but of course, our problem was, you may have heard of this project 2 years ago, but COVID had just descended. So we arrived in Fort Lauderdale on the 4th of February, and my colleagues in the UK were saying, Philip, for goodness sake, get your crew out of the United States as quickly as you can, because the world is closing down and you might be trapped there for 6 months if you're not careful. So we dispersed pretty quickly. I found a berth for the ship, and it's only now really that I've been able to, come back and talk about this whole project. And so, in summary, we had taken some 5 months to cover 6,000 miles, and had shown that certainly these vessels could easily have coped with crossing a sea like the Atlantic. And if there was one small benefit of the pandemic, and clearly there weren't many, it gave me time to document and write and research about some of the things that I've been talking about. And I've put this book together called Atlantic BC. It's some 200 odd pages. It's got some 30 color photos in it. And if you'd like me to sign a copy of it, and you'd like a copy, some of them are going to be available outside when I can talk and sign them. And for those that are listening or viewing this online, they can order a copy at atlanticbc.net or email me for further information at info@phoenicia.co.uk, phoenicia.org.uk. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you ever so much for being a very attentive audience. And if there's time, Steve, I'm happy to answer a few questions, but up to you.